Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this YouTube video today. This is going to be that second video. That's a two-part series from my first video. I should be able to complete the game by the time that this video has been completed, but I did want to go through a factory tour on what I ended up doing. So the very first thing I want to talk about was going to be the power. The power is going to be oil-based, and as you can see, I'm training this in. I'm going to be training about 1,800 oil. That's all coming from the Spire Coast. This oil will be used for both my power and also some of the product that I'm going to be creating in order to build those one elevator parts per minute. Alright, we are right underneath where that oil ends up getting dropped off. The oil gets dropped off in two different sections. The first section is going to be for products that I'm end up creating. The other part is going to be for the fuel that I need in order to power the generators, in order to produce all of my power that I need for both this section and also the main section, the production plant that I will be going over a little bit later. Mainly the things that I'm going to be producing over here will be that petroleum coke, and it's going to be that fuel. Hi, I ended up having several of these signs throughout the factory, and so I wanted to kind of touch base on each one of these. The first sign that I want to talk about was going to be my original plan, because as everybody knows that plays Satisfactory, plans end up changing. I first wanted to use biocoal throughout the entire factory and even use that for my power. However, for what I ended up finding out, the way that the game is designed, the more trees that you end up cutting down, the flaggier the game ends up getting. As you start cutting down trees, it actually uses more resources on the game, and so you still can do this if you had a strong enough computer. I didn't want to really push my computer, and I just wanted to see if this was actually going to be possible without using any coal nodes. So how I ended up getting through this is through petroleum coke, which is being produced over on this left-hand side. I didn't really know how much coke that I needed throughout this process, and so I decided to overproduce and then sink what I did not need. I'm producing a total of 1,350 petroleum coke per minute, meaning that I needed to use more than one of those belts. A belt within Satisfactory could only hold 750, and so I'm roughly using 2 belts that are full. The excess coke that I am currently producing within this plant, I'm immediately sinking within here, and you'll see why a little bit later on. As far as the other half, the fuel that I am actually using, I'm using a total of 18 refineries for a total of 720 fuel. I am producing some polymer resin for rubber over here, and so that was actually the inspiration of why I wanted to use that petroleum coke and really started looking into it. I've never done this throughout any of the playthroughs that I've done it in the past, and so I want to challenge myself and try something new. I am producing more than one belt of polymer resin here at a time, and I'm also sinking it within this section. Meaning that 0% of the polymer resin that I am creating is actually making it over to that production plant. Right underneath that production plant of both the fuel and the petroleum coke, I am immediately dropping that fuel down to the other level below. So I am right underneath where that refinery is actually going to be. Now, the amount of fuel that I could actually produce is only going to be 9,000. However, as you can see, I end up using more than 9,000 at a time. So I am stretching my power as thin as possible, and I actually need some storage capacitors in order to grab this. This is mainly due to the particle accelerators that we end up having at the very end in order to get some of the end game product. Coming over to the second floor, this is the lines that I ended up pushing in order to make that rubber, and so I am using that petroleum coke plus also the polymer resin. It's going to go over to a macro factory, which you'll be able to see at a bird's eye view. Going back over to this first floor, we're going to be right back over to this train line where that oil is going to be produced. Once I end up making a 180, we're going to see the basic kind of idea of how Satisfactory ends up working. First, you end up putting miners onto the ground. This particular miner only pulls 18 ore per minute, which really isn't all that lot. Now the ore is going to be put into the smelter. For this particular one, that 18 ore is going to create 6 ingots of the deuterium that I end up needing. Once you end up having that ore, you're going to be able to create those basic supplies. With those basic supplies within that ingots that I'm going to be creating, I'm creating a total of 30 quick wires made. Even though I am producing over 10,000 materials, and for this endgame item, 30 quick wire is all I need. Continuing along the path over here, we could actually see that rubber that was being produced that is going to go on this belt. This belt ends up following this line over here and is actually directly underneath us, along with a few other materials. A total of 382.5 rubber is on that line. These numbers can be hyper-specific, and I have a total of max of 750 items per belt, and so I really need to make sure that I maximize my belt without going over. I am also pulling a total of 325 raw quartz. Now this raw quartz is running parallel over to the train line that will be bringing into the oil, so I am producing it before it even gets this far. With that 325 raw quartz, I am pulling a total of 12.5 silica per minute. I realize that for you advanced satisfactory players, that may not seem like a lot. You really do not need that much silica if you end up using a lot of the alternate recipes. Now, I do need a total of 162 quartz crystal per minute, so it is just a little bit higher than I would like, but still fairly easy, and you don't need to do that pure quartz recipe. The last thing within this line that ends up being pulled in before we start going over to the production factory is only 12.5 sulfur per minute. Sulfur is one of the few resources within Satisfactory that does not need to be processed in order to be used. This is one of those things that you don't need to turn it into an ingot. You could use that raw sulfur in order to produce it. As I continue down this path, I'm going to be marking some of these things. There's going to be a space moth that you're going to see that's flying around the map. This thing is my biggest headache. I am within the flight path of the moth, and so as you see it fly, it does clip through these buildings, but these buildings that I currently have is mainly just a support structure for those trains, and then also for the belts that I have underneath my feet currently right now. You may have seen the train that is currently going to go over our heads. That train's sole purpose is to produce 600 nitrogen gas. This nitrogen gas is kind of overproducing, but I'd much rather have a single line nitrogen gas that ends up coming in rather than underproducing, and you can't mix it since it is going to be a gas or a liquid state as in Satisfactory. Going down from these lines, I am also pulling bauxite. Bauxite is much needed in order to create aluminum, and so I am pulling the bare minimum amount of bauxite and then pulling it directly over here. I am simply belting that in and then combining it over to my walkways that are underneath. From here, this is going to be the end point within my factory. This is going to be the main production factory, and it's broken up into 3 different floors. The 3 different floors, I'm going to go from the bottom and then directly up, and then we're going to see exactly where all these raw resources end up coming from. I wanted to actually build this factory as a tour aspect of it, so it should flow pretty well. Now, I did have a little bit of time in order to fully generate those 10,000 parts that I needed, so I did end up building a skate park within Satisfactory. From this section, you will be able to see all of those storage batteries that I ended up talking about. These actually do get used and is part of that production plan. Surprisingly, only 105 concrete is needed in order for everything to be created within this factory. I did need to max out my copper powder though, and so I do have a total of 200 copper powder end up coming in, which is going to be a total of 600 copper. You did notice that I will get hit every once in a while once I am underneath here. This happens to do just with the patch, and I have not cleared out any of the enemies that end up spawning in. I am producing a total of 330 steel pipe per minute. This is done within this floor. Same with the total of 15 steel beams that is needed in order to create everything from above. However, I am producing over 1,200 ingots per minute, and that is overproducing. I did end up messing my numbers a little bit, and so you will see things that are overclocked or stuff that's not within a logical area, such as an additional constructor producing wire where I'm producing wire at another point within the factory. Welcome to the second floor of my factory. This is where the vast majority of the production will actually be. All of this, everything is being produced over here through the raw items that you end up seeing below. For the wire that I'm currently running, I am using the iron wire recipe. I currently have 2 lines of 19 constructors long, that's each making wire. One thing that I like to note about the iron wire recipe, it is 55.556% efficient. However, there is a lot more iron within the world than there is copper, so I actually highly recommend using the iron wire recipe. I end up producing cables halfway through in order just to lower the amount of wire that is within this belt. And so I'm actually producing stuff a little bit sooner than before just because of my restrictions within that 750 belt lines. I am currently producing 433.5 cable is being produced, so most of the wire that I am using will be turned over into cable. However, I still have spare wire for other parts later on in the factory. I have a total of 118.5 iron plates are being produced. Since I ended up using the iron wire recipe, I can still use those iron ingots from below, so I'm still using that exact same raw resource. That is yet another reason why I like using that iron wire recipe. A total of 1,552.5 wire is being created within this factory. It's going in and out of those sushi belts in order to be created for those wire for the cable as well. As far as the rotors, I'm only producing about 23 rotors per minute. Right after those plates are created, I send it through the sushi belts, and then it ends up coming along these lines and then getting fed into these assemblers where I'm producing about 35.5 reinforced iron plates per minute. Over on this side, I am producing 34 stators, which is more than just used for the motors that are needed within this line. Surprisingly, I only need about 9 motors in order to produce everything within this factory for those 10,000 machines. Over on the other side, I do have an assembler that's currently creating just less than 12 modular frames. You only need 5 smart plating in order to create everything. You will notice as things end up moving on throughout this factory, I'm creating less and less. You do need 15 automated wiring that is done per minute if you want to create one of each of the endgame items. This is the reason why you feel like you constantly need that wire, and another reason why I like using that iron wire recipe. Surprisingly, you do not need industrial beams until this late within the manufacturing. I do need just a little over 13 industrial beams per minute. Those industrial steel beams immediately get used for the heavy modular frames. I am using the alternate recipes on here in order to create those heavy modular frames. I currently have 2.5 of the versatile framework. This, yet again, is only used for those endgame items. From here, that concludes the second floor. You can see all the items that are being produced that's going to be on this belt. Anything that was coming up from below, that includes that power plant and also that bauxite can be seen over here. And so we're going to be moving over to the third floor where more complex items are going to be made. Over here on the third floor, this is where all of the complex items are actually going to be made. You will notice that this is still fairly small and takes up just as much space as the second floor does, even though I'm using larger machines. This has to come to the fact that I am producing less of each one of the items. I'm producing about 37 circuit boards per minute. Yes, it is across several machines, but it is only going to be that 37 circuit boards. I have one machine for one high-speed connector. Surprisingly, that's all that you need. I am creating 2.5 of the modular engines. I am overclocking this in order to save space on this one, and so this is actually done intentionally. Since I end up using a lot of alternate recipes, that alternate recipes has to come from somewhere. I am creating a total of 9 crystal oscillators in order per minute to produce my end games. I am producing a total of 5.5 computers. 12.5 sulfuric acid, that is where that sulfur ended up coming from before. You combine equal parts sulfur with equal parts water, you end up getting sulfuric acid, and this is actually where I needed it. From here, I need an additional 10 alumina solution. This alumina solution is just a mix between water and bauxite. Continuing on with the manufacturers, I am creating 2 adaptive control units. Everything is still going to be within that one belt. This is where the alumina is actually going to be created. I did have a few issues when I was creating the alumina. Not necessarily the alumina solution, but honestly the aluminum scrap. The aluminum scrap is one of the few items that you end up producing more of with the output than you do with the input, so I did have to do some rebalancing with my belt work. The very first part of getting that aluminum scrap will be this alumina solution, and then I ended up producing 873 of that scrap, and I ended up putting that within 2 belts. I do like the pure recipe, and so I'm producing 432.5 of the ingots, and then I'm only producing aluminum casing, which is right below for that 219. Within that aluminum scrap and all of the casings, you can create 20 heat sinks. This is where those numbers tend to sneak up on you, and it will be with that aluminum. Aluminum will be your bottleneck in order for your tier 4 space elevator parts, and it's something that you really need to pay attention to once you start unlocking the aluminum trees. I did need a total of 7 radio controlled units. This is where a lot of that quartz is actually going to be used from, which is going to be created from that crystal oscillator. You only need a single pressure conversion cube, a single magnetic control rod, and a single supercomputer. Then, as you can't tell, it's going to be a single turbo motor. So each one of these end game machines are only creating one of each one, because that is all I need. Now, I did need a total of 2 fused modular frames because each machine only uses 1, but it only produces a half of the pressurized conversion cubes per minute, so I had to double that aspect of it. I am currently using 10 cooling systems per minute, and that is where that gas ends up coming from. Once we end up getting that gas, it does get put within that cooling system. For that 12.5 sulfur, that is the only thing that is going to be used for is going to be for the batteries. You do not need sulfur for any other parts within the endgame items. This is the final room for my production plant. This is where I'm actually building one of the thermal propulsion rockets, 1 magnetic field generator, 1 assembly director, and then 1 nuclear pasta. You will notice that some of this does kind of clip through the wall for a little bit. This is only for gathering. After I'm done gathering, let me show you what I end up doing. Alright, this is my manufacturer for the magnetic field generator. As you can see, I end up having 2 storage units. Once I end up removing this, I do have over that 4,000 that I needed, so I'm just going to remove this aspect of it, and I'm even going to be removing this. Once you end up dismantling, all that you need to do is move one of these belts and end up putting it back over to the main line. I'm still not quite there with this particular item, and so I'm still going to let that run. Once that is done, I'm going to be removing this belt and adding it over to this main line in order for it to get merged in with everything else. Same with this section over here. This section has just put everything within 1 storage unit. I'm going to be removing this and then putting it within this line. Once everything produced, everything goes on this main line, and this is everything that is left over. Anything that is pushed over into this overflow ends up going through this tube and then ends up going over into this awesome sink. You will notice that there is going to be stuff that I did not account for, such as this bauxite, this rubber. I have a few of the circuit boards that end up sneaking through. A lot of my numbers, they ended up getting messed up for a little bit, so I've always had to pivot. And within pivot, that's just part of this game and the reason why I end up loving this game so much. Here is the other side over to this factory, and I just want to kind of touch base with this aspect of it, since this part of the factory is what I feel is one of the most important parts of it. Underneath me is more belt lines, and within the belt lines I end up going over here, and I'm actually belting in all of the iron ore that's within this area, and then pushing it within the factory. I did think about building the factory within this section, however, I felt like bringing it up and over and near the water is a more centralized location. Between the oil I needed, the sulfur, the quartz, the bauxite, everything seemed to make a little bit more sense if I just pivoted over to that section. But a lot of the resources end up coming from this location. And I don't say a lot of resources because I'm actually different kinds of resources, but a lot just because of how much iron that I end up using. There is a lot of good nodes within this section, and so I just kind of wanted to showcase this. You will notice that I ended up building a refinery on top of a rock. That just happened to be with an update, and I figured I'm going to leave it. But every single one of my miners over here will be overclocked, and it is going to be used. This area ends up having some limestone that you can turn into concrete, which I'm not using either, but I still left it open just in case if I needed it. I do currently have hard drives going on, and I have spare hard drives within this section. Once I end up hitting that configure the MAM, it looks like the few blueprints that I'm no longer need, I could actually unlock, such as like the supercomputer. Over here is how I end up producing copper powder. Now you may be asking, how do I get 200 copper powder when I'm only using one copper node? The biggest thing for this one is going to be the alloy ingots. I am using some of the copper ore plus also the iron ore in order to produce these ingots that are immediately going over to this copper powder that I'm going to be using. Alright, well, thanks to some editing magic, we are able to complete the game finally. And so I have all the parts that I am ready to go. So the next thing I'm going to do is simply connect, connect, that is running. I wanted to spend this time to just thank everybody that watched these videos. I know it wasn't too, I know that it was a little rough cut. It's new for me. Just doing anything that is new is always challenging, especially when you're trying to put yourself out there like that. So I did want to thank everybody for just the support on this. It truly means a lot. If anybody has any kind of questions about the numbers that I ended up using in particular, I still have my Excel spreadsheet that is just operational. Like I said, it is not 100%. I do have some wonky numbers that are currently in there, which is the reason why I did have to adjust. But if anybody wants that, feel free just to reach out and I will be able to provide that for you. It does look like that we are through the first item within the tier list, and we end up getting those cubes that are within the space elevator. Now we have those thermal propulsion rockets. Now we're just waiting on what should have been the easier things, but you need a lot more of them. I am playing this without any kind of mods, and so all of this is 100% done in vanilla. The main factory itself that produces all of these, it does not use any coal, it does not use any iron rods, any screws, anything that has to do with uranium at all, and then zero plastic. So I'm not doing any kind of that information. But you will notice that there is some coating that's along this bottom end, and I have some plastic and rods just with me, and this is mainly used for building in order to get like those stairs, for example, or it's like this screw with the awesome shop that was within that aspect as well. So I did end up producing those just for more aesthetic reasons, but as far as these space elevator parts have been built, like I said, without screws, rods, coal, plastic, or uranium. And I was able to get around through a lot of that using the alternate recipes. I did not use any kind of tools besides Excel in order to build this out. I personally like doing the number crunching myself, but that's only because I really like messing around with data on that aspect of it, and that's the reason why my numbers were off. If you don't like to do that trial and error type aspect, there are those internet tools out there. I would recommend that you use those. However, if you do like this middle ground between going off the cuff versus planning things out, I would recommend using Excel for this type of thing. Um, Looks like we're almost about halfway done. I did end up putting over an awesome shop within this area. That way we can get that golden ticket once it's done, and then I ended up throwing in 10 tickets over here. Seal. And there is 0 objective up in the top right hand corner.